Fallon had been excluded from a lot of things over the years. Family decisions made without her input. Professional conversations redirected when she entered the room. The particular architecture of a family dynamic that had spent 2 decades communicating, in 100 small ways, that her presence was optional and her absence was manageable. She had learned to build her life around that architecture rather than against it. She had taken her skills and her discipline and her specific understanding of how money moved through large organizations, and she had built a career that existed entirely outside the circle her parents had drawn around their world. She had been good at it, better than anyone in her family had thought to notice. Then her parents announced the gala. $275 million in potential investment capital. The most significant fundraising event her father's firm had ever organized. 3 years of relationship building culminating in one evening where the right people in the right room were going to make decisions that would define the next decade of the company. Her parents had organized the guest list personally. Fallon's name was not on it. The explanation had come in a phone call from her mother, carefully worded, the language of exclusion dressed in the clothing of practicality. The event was for investors and senior partners. It wasn't really Fallon's world. There would be other occasions. Fallon had said she understood. She had meant it, she understood exactly. She had ended the call and gone back to her desk and continued working on the analysis she had been building for 3 weeks. The analysis that 3 of her father's lead investors had been waiting for. The analysis that their fund's next allocation decision depended on. The gala started at 7. By 9:47, her phone was ringing. Before Fallon's phone rings at 9:47, and the senior partner says the investors need her in that room, hit subscribe right now. Because the moment her father watches her walk through the door of the gala, he didn't invite her to and answer questions that nobody else in the room could answer, is one of the most quietly powerful moments in this entire story. New videos every single week. Hit like if you have ever been excluded from a room while holding exactly what the room needed. Drop a comment. Have you ever had your work show up in a place that the people who underestimated you couldn't ignore? Now let's go back to Boston, because Fallon is at her desk. The gala started an hour ago, and her phone is about to ring. My name is Fallon. I am 29 years old and I live in Boston, Massachusetts. I have spent the past 5 years building a professional life that existed entirely outside the circle my family had drawn around theirs. Not out of rebellion, not out of the dramatic rejection of a legacy I found oppressive, but out of the specific understanding that the circle had never fully opened to include me, and that waiting for it to open was a less productive use of my time than building something of my own. My father ran an investment firm. My mother managed the firm's client relationships with the particular social precision of someone who understood that in their world, relationships were infrastructure. I had grown up watching both of them work and had learned more than they had intended to teach me. The gala had been in development for 3 years. My father had mentioned it at family dinners in the way he mentioned things that were consuming his professional attention, in the specific shorthand of someone who assumed the people around him understood the stakes without requiring full explanation. $275 million in potential investment capital. The most significant fundraising event the firm had ever organized. 3 years of relationship cultivation with a specific cohort of institutional investors, culminating in one evening, where the right people in the right room were going to make decisions that would define the next decade of what my father had spent 30 years building. He had been working toward this evening since before I had left for Boston. It was, by any measure, the most important night of his professional life. The guest list had been curated over 6 months, my mother's primary project for the first quarter of the year, the careful assembly of the exact right people in the exact right configuration to produce the evening my father needed. Investors my father had been cultivating for years. Senior partners whose presence would signal the firm's internal confidence. Strategic guests whose attendance would communicate to the institutional investors that the room they were entering had weight and credibility. My mother had approached the list with the specific social intelligence she brought to everything, knowing not just who to include, but in what proportion, at what tables, in proximity to which other guests. She had been building this room for months. I had heard about it at every family dinner since January. My mother called on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 days before the gala, with the particular careful pacing she used when she had prepared what she was going to say in advance. She said the event was really structured around the firm's investor relationships and senior partner community. She said it was a professional occasion in the specific sense that the guest list needed to reflect the firm's direct stakeholder relationships. She said there would be other opportunities for family involvement. She said she hoped I understood. She said it all warmly and with genuine kindness, and in the specific register of someone delivering a decision that had already been made and was being communicated rather than discussed. I said I understood. I meant it. I understood exactly what was being communicated and exactly what it was built on. I ended the call and went back to my desk. My desk in my Boston apartment had the organized density of someone who had been living inside a single complex project for 3 weeks. The dual monitors with different sections of the analysis open on each, the printed source documents annotated in 2 colors, the notes from 3 separate calls with the senior partner who had engaged me, the financial modeling files that had been running and rerunning as I refined the inputs. The sector risk assessment was the most technically demanding piece of work I had taken on since leaving the advisory firm 2 years ago, not because the methodology was unfamiliar, but because the stakes were real and the investors waiting for it were sophisticated enough that anything less than complete accuracy would be visible immediately. I had been building it for 3 weeks. It was nearly done. The gala was in 3 days and I was not on the guest list and I had work to finish. The engagement had come through a professional contact, a mutual connection who had mentioned my name to a senior partner at my father's firm, who had been looking for an independent analyst to conduct a sector risk assessment for 3 of the firm's lead investors. The investors had structured their allocation decision timeline around receiving the analysis before making any commitments at the gala. They wanted independent verification of the sector assumptions underlying the firm's investment thesis before committing at the scale the evening was designed to produce. The senior partner had contacted me through the mutual connection, had explained the scope of the work, and had sent the engagement letter. I had signed it and begun work before I had disclosed that the firm's founder was my father. The work was the work regardless of the family connection. I had wanted it to be evaluated on that basis. The gala was on a Saturday evening, and I was at my desk by 7 when the event was scheduled to begin, not because I was making a point about being excluded, just because the analysis was nearly complete and Saturday evening was as good a time to finish it as any. The final section needed one more pass through the modeling and a careful review of the sourcing before I would consider it ready. I had been working since 10 that morning. My phone was face down beside my keyboard. I had turned it face down sometime in the afternoon when the notifications had been interrupting my concentration and had not turned it back over. The city outside my Boston apartment window was doing its Saturday evening thing. The gala was somewhere in the middle of it. I was at my desk. The analysis was open. I was nearly done. Fallon had graduated with an economics degree at 22 and had taken a position at a global financial advisory firm in New York. Not her father's world, not the investment side, but the analytical infrastructure that informed the investment side. She had spent 4 years there learning how institutional capital moved through sectors, how risk was assessed at scale, how the models that informed the largest allocation decisions were built and stress-tested and revised. She had been good at it in the specific way that produced quiet professional recognition rather than visible promotion. The kind of good that made senior colleagues bring her their hardest problems rather than the kind that made managing directors mention her name at firm events. She had left at 27. She had taken everything she had learned and built something that was entirely hers. The independent practice had taken 18 months to reach financial stability and 3 years to reach the point where the work came to her rather than requiring her to pursue it. She had positioned herself specifically in sector risk analysis for mid to large investment funds, a narrow enough specialization that she was genuinely expert in it, broad enough that the market for it was consistent. Her reputation had been built through referrals rather than marketing, one satisfied engagement leading to an introduction, one introduction leading to a contract. The specific compounding of professional credibility that happened when the work was consistently accurate and the people who received it remembered who had built it. By the time the senior partner from her father's firm had contacted her, she had worked with 11 different funds across 4 sectors and had not had to look for a new engagement in 14 months. The call from the senior partner had come through a mutual professional connection, a former colleague from the advisory firm who had moved into fund management and who had mentioned Fallon's name when the senior partner had described what he was looking for. The senior partner had contacted her by email, professional, specific, describing the engagement scope clearly and asking whether she had availability and interest. His email had not mentioned the firm's founder by name. The firm's name had been in the email signature, but Fallon had worked with enough firms that the name had not immediately connected to her father's operation. Her father's firm operated under a formal entity name that was different from the family name, and that she had not encountered in her professional context before. She had responded to the email before she had made the connection. The senior partner's description of the engagement had been precise: 3 lead investors requiring an independent sector risk assessment before committing to a significant capital allocation at an upcoming investor event. He had described the sector parameters, the analytical depth required, the timeline, and the fee structure. The work was exactly the kind Fallon did, and the timeline was demanding but manageable. She had asked 3 clarifying questions about the data access she would need and the format the investors preferred for the deliverable. He had answered all 3 clearly. She had said she was interested and had asked him to send the formal engagement letter. It arrived the following morning. She had read through it completely, the firm's full legal name in the header, and had understood, reading the formal name, whose firm she had just agreed to work for. She had sat with the disclosure question for 2 days before resolving it, not because the answer was unclear, but because she had wanted to be certain she was making the right decision for the right reasons, rather than the convenient one. She had concluded that the work was legitimate, her qualifications were genuine, and the investors who needed the analysis deserved the best version of it regardless of the family connection. She had also concluded that disclosing after signing, rather than before, was the wrong sequence. That integrity required the disclosure to precede the work beginning, rather than follow the contract. She had called the senior partner and told him. He had been quiet for a moment and had then said he appreciated her telling him, and that the engagement stood. The work was what mattered, and her credentials were what had produced the referral. Her father had found out 14 days into the engagement. She did not know exactly how, whether the senior partner had told him or whether he had encountered the engagement documentation through his own review of the firm's contracted work. He had called on a Tuesday evening, and his voice had carried the specific quality of a man who was uncertain how to characterize a situation he had not anticipated. He had asked if it was true that she was working for the firm. She had said yes and had explained the sequence: the referral, the contact, the disclosure after signing, the senior partner's decision to proceed. Her father had been quiet for a moment. He had said he wished she had told him before it had started. She had said she had told the relevant person before it started. He had not said much after that. The call had ended without warmth but also without a request to stop. The analysis was due the week following the gala. The investors had structured their decision timeline deliberately, wanting to receive the independent assessment before making any formal commitments at the event, and then having the full documented version in hand during the commitment confirmation period that followed. The gala was the moment of relationship and momentum, the evening where 3 years of cultivation was going to produce the conversations that mattered. The analysis was the foundation those conversations needed to stand on. Fallon had understood this from the engagement brief and had organized her 3 weeks of work around delivering something that would hold up to the scrutiny of institutional investors who had made it clear they were not going to commit without it. The gala was Saturday. The analysis was nearly complete. The timing had not been her design. It was simply how the calendar had assembled itself. The gala began at 7, and Fallon knew it because she had noted the start time when her mother had called, not to mark the exclusion, but because she was the kind of person who noted times that were relevant to situations she was tracking. She was at her desk at 7 with the analysis open and the final section in progress, the sector volatility modeling that required the most careful attention of any component in the document and that she had been saving for a stretch of uninterrupted time. Saturday evening had provided that. The city outside her window had the particular quality of a weekend night, distant and ambient and entirely undemanding of her attention. She had her second coffee of the evening. She had her modeling software and her source documents and the quiet she needed. While the gala's guests were arriving at the venue her parents had spent 3 months selecting, the particular kind of Boston event space that communicated serious money without ostentation, the kind her father's clients expected, and her mother knew how to find, Fallon was building the final section of the analysis with the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had been living inside the material long enough to move through it without resistance. The sector volatility modeling required her to hold multiple variables in a relationship simultaneously, the kind of analytical work that looked effortless from outside and was genuinely demanding from inside. She had done it hundreds of times. She was doing it well. The room her parents had assembled was filling 300 miles away, and she was at her desk, and the work was nearly done. Her father was good at rooms like this one. She had always known that about him, had grown up watching him work gatherings with the specific ease of someone who had spent 30 years building relationships in exactly these contexts. The first hour of the gala would have run well. She knew this not from any report, but from her understanding of how her father operated in his professional element, the handshakes that conveyed genuine familiarity, the questions that communicated he had been paying attention since the last conversation, the particular social architecture of a man who had been building toward this evening for 3 years and had arrived at it prepared. The lead investors would have been present and engaged. The room would have had the momentum her father had been building toward. The first hour would have been exactly what he had spent 3 years making it. By 8 o'clock, the room would have moved from the opening social exchange into the substantive conversations that were the gala's actual purpose. The specific shift that happened in rooms like this one, when the pleasantries had run their course, and the people present began talking about the things they had actually come to discuss. Her father's lead investors were sophisticated people who had attended enough events of this kind to understand the difference between the social layer and the business layer and to move efficiently between them. By 8, the business layer would have been active. Allocation frameworks, sector positioning, the investment thesis her father's firm had been refining for 3 years and was presenting that evening as the foundation for the capital commitment the gala was designed to produce. Fallon knew the thesis. She had been stress testing it for 3 weeks. She did not know the exact moment the question had been raised. She would reconstruct the timeline later from the senior partner's account of the evening. Approximately 8:45, one of the lead investors had asked about sector risk in the proposed allocation, a specific technical question about the volatility assumptions underlying the investment thesis, the kind of question that required precise analytical grounding rather than relationship confidence to answer. It was the right question. It was, in fact, the question her 3 weeks of work had been built specifically to address. The investor had not asked it aggressively. He had asked it the way sophisticated investors ask necessary questions, with the specific directness of someone who needed an accurate answer before they could move forward with confidence. The room had not had the answer. The question had done what unanswered questions did in rooms of high-stakes capital allocation. It had created a specific uncertainty that the room's momentum could not simply continue past. Other investors had picked it up, not because they had not been satisfied before it was raised, but because once the question existed, it required resolution before the conversations around it could reach the conclusions they had been building toward. Her father would have known what the shift felt like. He had been in enough rooms to recognize the specific quality of attention that changed when a significant investor needed something the room didn't have. The evening was not derailed. But it was paused in the way that a 3-year campaign could be paused by a single precise question that nobody present could answer with the technical accuracy the asker required. The senior partner had stepped away from the table at some point between 8:45 and 9, away from the room, away from the investors, into the quieter space outside the main event area, where phone calls could be made without contributing to the ambient uncertainty inside. He had the engagement letter in his contacts. He had Fallon's number from 14 weeks of working communication. He had been the one who had engaged her, who had managed the relationship, who understood better than anyone in that building what she had been building for 3 weeks and how close it was to being ready. He looked at the time. It was approaching 9:30. The analysis was due in 4 days. The investors needed it tonight. He found Fallon's number and called. Fallon had turned her phone face down sometime in the mid-afternoon, when the notification interruptions had been breaking her concentration at the wrong moments. The specific decision of someone deep enough in focused work that the cost of interruption exceeded the cost of missing something. She had been working with the phone face down for 5 hours when it vibrated against the desk at 9:47 with the particular insistence of an incoming call rather than a notification. She reached for it without looking away from her screen, flipped it over to check the name before deciding whether to answer. The senior partner's name. She looked at the time, 9:47 on a Saturday evening. The gala had been running for almost 3 hours. She picked up on the second ring and said his name as a question. He was concise, the specific efficiency of someone who understood that the situation required information transfer rather than context building, and that she would understand the implications without requiring them to be spelled out. He explained the investor question, the sector risk question that had been raised at 8:45, the technical precision it required, the fact that nobody currently in the room had the analytical grounding to answer it with the accuracy the investor needed. He explained the room's current state, not collapsed, not failed, but holding in the specific suspended way of a high-stakes conversation that needed something it didn't have before it could move forward. He said the lead investor had asked who the independent analyst was. He said he had told him. He said the investor had said he wanted the analysis tonight if it was possible. He asked how close she was. She told him the truth directly, 90% complete. The final section still in progress. The specific component he was describing as the room's need was drafted and had been through one verification pass, but had not yet received her final review. She said the section was sound. She would not have described it as sound if it had not been, but that she had planned one more pass through the sourcing before she considered it ready to deliver. She asked him two questions: what format the investor preferred for an immediate share, and whether the investor needed the full document or the specific section addressing the volatility assumptions. He said the specific section, formatted for immediate reading, as quickly as she could produce it without compromising accuracy. She looked at the section on her left monitor. She said 20 minutes. 20 minutes was the time she needed to do the final pass properly. Not the rushed version that produced adequate work, but the version that produced the work she was willing to put her name on in a room of institutional investors who would remember who had built it. She worked through the section with the specific focused speed of someone who knew the material completely and was moving through a verification process rather than an analytical one, checking the sourcing citations against the original documents, confirming the modeling outputs against the stress test scenarios she had run the previous week, reading the conclusions against the data that supported them to make sure the language was precise rather than approximate. She found two places where she sharpened the phrasing. She found one footnote that needed a citation correction. She fixed both. Then she read it through once more from the beginning. She sent the section at 10:11, 24 minutes after the call, 4 minutes over the 20 she had asked for, the extra 4 minutes the result of the citation correction that had required her to pull the original source document and verify the exact figure before she would accept the footnote as accurate. She formatted it cleanly, the firm's engagement header, her name and credentials in the document footer, the section title and date at the top. The content organized in the sequence that moved from methodology through findings to implications in the way she had learned, produced the clearest reading experience for investors who were receiving analytical work under time pressure. She sent it to the senior partner's email with a brief note: the full document will follow in its final form by Tuesday as contracted. This section is complete and verified. She put her phone face up on the desk and waited. The senior partner had returned to the room with the section printed. He had found a printer in the venue's administrative area, which told Fallon something about how seriously he had taken the 20 minutes she had asked for. He had distributed copies to the lead investors at the table, with the professional efficiency of someone who understood that the way information arrived in a room mattered as much as the information itself. Cleanly, without drama, as the natural next step in an evening that had asked a question and was now receiving its answer. The lead investor who had raised the sector risk question had picked up his copy and begun reading with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, and was now assessing whether what had arrived was what he needed. The lead investor had read through the section. Fallon would learn later that it had taken him approximately 8 minutes, which for a document of that density indicated he had moved through it with genuine comprehension rather than surface review. He had set it down and looked at the senior partner, and had said 4 words that the senior partner would repeat to Fallon verbatim when he called her back 40 minutes later. "We need her here." He had not said it as a request or a suggestion. He had said it with the specific declarative certainty of someone who had just read something that told him exactly what kind of mind had produced it, and had decided he wanted access to that mind before the evening concluded. The senior partner had looked across the table at Fallon's father. Her father had looked at the document in the investor's hands. Then he pushed his chair back and stood up. Her phone rang at 10:28, not the senior partner this time, her father. She had been expecting a call back from the senior partner and had been sitting at her desk with the analysis open, reviewing the remaining sections with the particular attention of someone who had just sent something significant and was already thinking about what came next. Her father's name on the screen was not what she had anticipated. She looked at it for a moment, the specific pause of someone deciding how to receive an unexpected thing, and then picked up. His voice was different from the Tuesday call 2 weeks ago, and different from the way he sounded at family dinners, and different from any version she could immediately place in her memory. He said her name. Then he said, "I need to ask you something." He asked if she could come to the venue. He said it directly, not with the careful framing of the phone calls that had preceded it, not with the practiced language of someone managing a situation, just directly, as a request from a man who needed something and was asking the person who had it. He said the investors wanted to meet the analyst. He said her section had shifted the room's conversation significantly and that the lead investor had asked specifically for her presence. He said he understood if it was not possible given the hour. Fallon looked at the clock on her desk, 10:28. She looked at the analysis on her screen, the remaining sections reviewed, the full document essentially complete. She looked at the venue address she had looked up 3 days ago when her mother had called. She said she would be there in 40 minutes. She closed the analysis file and saved it and shut her laptop and changed out of the clothes she had been wearing at her desk all day into the jacket and the specific outfit she had packed for professional meetings, not because she had anticipated this call, just because she always kept something appropriate available when she was working on engagements where a meeting could be called on short notice. She was in her car by 10:35. The drive from her Boston apartment to the venue her parents had selected was 40 minutes on a Saturday night. She had looked up the route 3 days ago, for reasons she had not fully examined at the time. She drove through the city with the particular focused quiet of someone who had been building toward something for 3 weeks, and was now simply going to where it needed to be delivered. She arrived at 11. The venue's event coordinator met her at the entrance with the slightly surprised efficiency of someone who had been told to expect an additional guest, and had organized the logistics accordingly. The gala was still running. She could hear the particular ambient sound of a formal event in its later hours, the conversations more settled than they would have been at 8, the room having found the register that events like this one found when the evening had gone well, and the people present had relaxed into genuine engagement. The event coordinator walked her through the main entrance and into the room, and she saw it, the room her parents had spent months building, the guests her mother had spent 6 months assembling, the evening her father had spent 3 years working toward. She was in it now. She looked for a senior partner. The lead investor found her before the senior partner did. He had apparently been watching the entrance since his 4 words had sent her father to the phone. He was a man in his late 50s, with the specific unhurried confidence of someone who had been making significant financial decisions for long enough that urgency and clarity were not in conflict for him. He introduced himself by name and said he had read her section twice on the way from the table to the entrance. He asked her 3 questions in the first 2 minutes, specific, technical, the kind that told her immediately that he had understood what she had written and wanted to test the boundaries of the analysis rather than its surface. She answered all 3 completely and without hesitation. He asked a 4th. She answered that one too. He said, "Let's find somewhere to sit." She was aware of her father's position in the room from the moment she entered. The specific peripheral awareness she had developed over 29 years of being in rooms with him and tracking where he was without appearing to track him. He was at the far end of the main table when she arrived and had not moved to intercept her, had watched the lead investor find her at the entrance, and had stayed at his position in the way of someone who understood that the most important thing happening in the room was happening without his management, and that managing it would be a mistake. She sat with the lead investor for 20 minutes and answered his questions, and did not look at her father directly during those 20 minutes. When she glanced across the room, after the investor had finished his questions, her father was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. She held it for a moment. Then the senior partner appeared beside her with 2 more guests who wanted to be introduced. She left the venue at 1 in the morning, the gala winding down, the lead investors having stayed later than the program's official end time, the room carrying the specific satisfied energy of an evening that had gone where it needed to go. The senior partner had walked her out and had said the full document on Tuesday would complete something significant. She had said it would be ready. She had said goodnight and walked to her car in the venue parking lot and sat for a moment before starting the engine. Her featured analyst credential was not on her jacket. Her name had not been on the guest list. She had arrived after 11 on a Saturday night in response to a phone call from the father who had not invited her, and had spent 40 minutes answering questions that nobody else in the room could answer, and had driven herself there and would drive herself back. She started the engine. The analysis was complete. The room had needed her. The guest list had been irrelevant from the moment The right question was asked. She drove back toward Boston through the Saturday night city with the windows slightly down and the particular clean feeling of work that had been done well arriving exactly where it was supposed to arrive. She was home by 1:45. She opened her laptop and finished the document.